And we're live.
Okay, welcome back, folks. Welcome to the public. We're going to continue with our work on accessory dwelling units, and we have Chris Cochran, Jacob Hemerick, and Karen Horn, and Ellen as backup to everybody. But let's start with Chris.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, Committee. Good to see you. Chris Cochran from the Department of Housing and Community Development. Apologize for my voice. I feel fine, but for some reason my voice is lost. So just to kind of get us back on track, I did watch a good portion of the White House presentation, and it was very affirming to kind of some of the ideas that we were thinking around, like, what would we need to do to set up an ADU program in Vermont? Mr. Chair, you are correct. ADUs is certainly an eligible expense for VHIP. So there's, I think, an opportunity there. And then just kind of brainstorming about, I would have to first say, this is not, in the governor's budget or something that he's recommending. But, if we were to do something like this, the model that I would use to kind of stand something like this up would be similar to what we did for zoning for great neighborhoods. We engaged our partners and our stakeholders. We raised a little money. We elevated the conversation. We did marketing and education to communities, and it worked. It led to your engagement on the bylaw modernization grants, and now we have 41 communities working to create, remove zoning barriers to housing opportunities in centers. I think a very similar model could be used to create, elevate ADUs as an option and opportunity in communities. Communities will need tools and resources to help them through this process. As you heard, there are some financing challenges that we need to overcome. And I think there's some big, real workforce challenges that I think need to be addressed. But I thought it was very interesting. One of the speakers mentioned, the solar community as a model, and I think we have an opportunity to do something like that in Vermont. If you package it and market it, and you create a market for it, I think the market will respond. And I think we can really boost productions of these ADUs in the state.
Let me ask you a question before you go on. I listening to that presentation and understanding more than I have before about the complexities of financing and developing. Let's assume the zoning issues are not there. Just going forward, it does strike me, and just correct me if I'm wrong, what the model might be. It doesn't seem to lend itself to each town having an expert in this area helping people along. It seems like somebody at the state level should be available to all the residents of the state, maybe to then work with the town zoning officer or something like that. But one person that we're small enough that someone can go to that is the guru, the czar of ADUs in the state of Vermont. Maybe it's more than one person, but as opposed to diluting it and giving out grants to each town, either on a competitive basis or whatever, and then trying to say, you do this. So let Chris just respond to that.
I think it's some of both. I think you need state leadership. I think where we can be helpful in this arena is convening, VHFA, AARP, the realtors, AARP, and VHCB to figure out how do we make this financing work? How do we create the toolkits, the communities need? But, I think what we've learned, we've seen the success in the AD programs was with somebody in a local community doing the work. That's where the permitting is going to need to happen. There needs to be one-on-one assistance. And I think I think there needs to be a state level entity supporting, guiding, leading, removing the barriers. And I think there needs to be, maybe it's a pilot, 6 or 7 communities, that are ready, that have the bylaws, that are interested in pursuing this and in making it happen. It's not unlike what we did for our downtown program. We provide the state level resources and the training, but the communities need to engage and step up and do this themselves. So I think it's some of both. We can't we would never have the resources to be able to visit all the homeowners who are interested. And it does take, I think, a lot of one-on-one visits, going to the home, talking to the homeowner, building their trust, building their confidence to take that next step. And I think you would need to have a local community rep being able to be that person.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
it could also be something we talk about with the regional planners, because it strikes me that we need navigators. I mean, we need navigators to help. They were fabulous for the healthcare transition, navigating onto the exchange. And I think we should learn from that whole system of navigators, and we could certainly set something up maybe and embed them with the regional planning commissions. I think we have vehicles to roll this out. I just think we need to do it in the right way. I think you're right. It's a little more local than at the state level, but we can figure this out.
Mr. Chair, I have a question.
Senator Rahm.
Chris, I have heard from a lot of folks, especially older folks, that they might like to do this, but they don't know how they would be treated locally if they ever went to sell their home, because it would no longer be owner occupied and it would have this other dwelling. It is an obstruction. I just wonder if the administration has a position on trying to streamline, even if we don't change the owner occupied piece, just what we do to help clarify that for homeowners, because I do think something needs to be done so that they feel more comfortable.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're kind of wandering into perhaps some chapter 117 changes that maybe I want to think about it a little bit more. But I think that's probably necessary to get that clarity.
Yeah. So, I mean, it does in some ways right now, and Ellen was going to research this, and maybe Karen has an opinion on this right now. Technically, I think if you start out with an ADU that's owner occupied and the owner moves out, you don't get the privilege of having that second unit anymore. My guess is very few people complain and it's there and it goes on. But if somebody wanted to do some local enforcement, they might be able to shut it down. Senator Clarkson.
So I think lots of people, when you're selling a home, would be interested in buying a home with as they call them, a mother-in-law apartment with an apartment in it. Particularly young couples want to help pay for their homes, and this generates income for them as they buy their first home. Possibly, I think there are lots of people for whom a homeowner, this kind of a home would be very attractive to buy. That was one of the reasons we could afford buying in Woodstock, was we bought a house that had an ADU carved into it. After the couple's kids had all gone off to college, they created an apartment on the second floor, and we reincorporated it into make it a one-family home. But you could have easily just also kept it as an apartment that would have generated income for our young family. So I think they can be very attractive for people.
Right. And that's one scenario. Another scenario is that the owner moves out and continues to own the home.
Right. And I think that's a big conversation we have to have.
Yeah. From my perspective, I think I agree with Senator Brock. We need to be able to create the financing to be able to support this kind of development. The state needs to put some incentives out there if they want to see this happen. But a lot of people can do this with their own money if the rules and the regulations and the laws are consistent with what the underwriters are looking for.
Yeah, and I also tend to agree with Senator Brock, and I'm sure he's be glad to hear me say. I mean, I would like to see this be developed in the private sector. I mean, it may need some period of time to bridge, but I think there's a niche here. I know lawyers, for instance, there's a group of lawyers that all they do is estate planning for Medicaid purposes, and a niche develop where they can make money to help people plan their estates so that they can, potentially at some point qualify. And I could see at some point down the road, this, just from listening to that tape, and they mentioned this, that it can be individual people set up businesses like HR businesses, payroll businesses. They just take it away from, they charge a fee and they walk you through the process. But at this point, we're really in the early stages, and I think we need the state to do the leadership on it. And maybe 5 or 10 years, maybe it'll transition where we don't need the state to do this, because it's a where did I heard something. Oh, there's a company that it's just starting out. It's called, you might want to check it out. It's called Picasso, I think, Pacaso. And they have done research to show that second homeowners have like 11 months of the year, their second home is vacant. And they take these upper end second homes and they set up an LLC. It's like a timeshare, but you buy an equity interest in the property. I think there is, in this context, there's a lot of people who are overhoused, and it's a solution to a lot of things. As they said in this thing, there's so many benefits of doing that I think an industry could develop around this.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to kind of do the trench work, sort it out, figure it out, and get out. It'd be great if that would be the perfect solution.
So do you think, I just want to know the starting point where we're at. I loved the fact that in the VHIP program, there was a special reference to accessory dwelling. In the broadest interpretation of all of this, the implementation phase, this centered expertise and technical assistance, and some, I guess it was done with one unit in Vermont. Under that law, if you're going to have a $32 million program for VHIP, I don't see any legal impediment for right now for the state to say, we're going to set $5 million aside for ADUs.
Yeah, no, I don't think you even need to pass a law. I think it could happen. I think the marketing and the direct services and the financing is the piece that we need to solve.
Thank you. Do you want to talk some more, Chris, or you turn it over to Jacob at any time?
Yeah,
a nice chart.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to pivot to that. You had this question the last time we talked about the difference between what an ADU is and what a duplex is. And Jacob quickly put together, it's a quick chart if you need something formally submitted to the committee. But I think it was helpful in kind of making that distinction.
Welcome, Jacob.
Good morning, Senators. So for the record, I'm Jake Emmerich. I'm a planning policy manager in the Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development. Some of my experience in the ADU world comes from being a local development review planner up in Chittenden County and in Milton, also planning and economic development director. Now live in central Vermont. I think the question that you asked was, how do duplexes and ADUs differ? And I think unlike a duplex, ADUs are a bit more restrictive in some ways, and there can be more permissive in other ways.
And your information is on our website for people looking under your name under today's testimony under documents.
Yeah, and I could share a spreadsheet.
I would appreciate if you could share it. I don't have access to a printer.
Okay, I'm trying to see if I can get that exact Excel. Oh, here we go. Got it. All right, so I broke this out, and this was done very quickly. And so in terms of the built form of, what does a duplex look like versus what is an ADU? Duplexes are typically defined in local bylaws as a single structure with a shared wall, whether it's a stacked duplex, one on top of the other or side by side. Whereas an ADU can be part of a single structure, or it can be a separate freestanding structure. In that way, it's a more flexible way to get to 2 units on a lot in a variety of different forms. In terms of tenancy for a duplex, they can be 100% rental, whereas under Vermont's current ADU law, one of the units on the lot must be owner occupied. In terms of financing and marketability, this is a little bit outside my expertise.
Jacob, we're going to interrupt you with questions. We have them.
Absolutely.
So on the tenancy situation, you say a duplex can be 100% rental. I assume it could be also 100% ownership, right?
Uh,
Two units, it's like a condominium at that point, right?
No,
Yeah, I guess it could be if there are two owners of a property and both lived in a single unit, then it could be potentially 100% owner occupied or 50% owner occupied.
I mean, you see them all over the place. You see
Yeah.
2-unit, they're owned by two different families. They share a common wall. I assume it's I don't know if it's a condo or co-op or whatever it is. But on the ADU, if you have with the size restriction and stuff like that, let's assume the traditional ADU is somebody develops an apartment within their house, and they rent it out, and the tenant comes to the owner occupied, and says, "I want to buy this unit. I don't want to rent it anymore." Is that possible under the ADU law?
Well, I think they would be jointly owning, just like in the duplex scenario, the whole property. And I suspect that there would have to be some legal provisions in the deed about who owns what and what their share is. But it sounds like that could be possible, but that's a bit outside my expertise.
Okay. I think that a lot of the units in Chittenden County, anyhow, you see a single structure and it's divided in half. And I know that it's owned by two different families. I don't know if they have
right.
I don't know what kind of legal relationship they have, but I've always considered that a duplex, regardless of whether it's rented or owned. It was
Right.
duplex.
And I think, Mr. Chair, they were purpose built. I mean, they're just blocks and blocks of these in every city, late 19th, early 20th century, and well into the 50s and 60s, duplexes were built intentionally for two different families to either own them separately or one to own and one to rent. I mean, they were built specifically for that purpose.
And it lowers the costs a little bit. And you see them in Chittenden County, you see them at the lower income scale, you see them at the high end scale too. They share a wall,
Well, and half of Europe's building stock are detached homes and semi-detached homes, which is what you're talking about.
Right.
So, I mean, it's a very common form of building.
Right. Okay, we can come back to that.
Yeah, and I think that kind of gets to line 6 there. To what extent can an individual unit be conveyed as a single property? And it's much easier to do a condominium or common interest ownership footprint lot with a duplex than it would be for an ADU, because of the owner occupancy and the pertinence provisions of the Title 117. So that's where, you could have a duplex and it could be two individual units that could be separately conveyed. But it could also be in joint ownership as a single piece of real estate product.
Right. So this highlights that if we got rid of the owner occupancy requirement, the distinction starts to get a little bit more blurred in terms of, you're saying can't be made into a condo ADU right now because of the owner occupancy requirement. But if we got rid of that, I'm wondering if at that point you can just sell 2 units off, and you sort of, here's where we get into the owner occupancy thing again. If you got rid of that and then you can sell 2 units off, you've essentially in some ways turned what was an incentive to increase density initially when you built this, when you went the ADU route, and now you've essentially turned an ADU into a duplex, and maybe the zoning doesn't allow for duplexes. That's where I get confused.
Yeah, and that would be a really granular exercise for district by district. Certainly there are zoning districts throughout Vermont that only allow single family dwellings. And so the accessory dwelling unit is the mechanism to allow that second unit on the lot. But a lot of the zoning districts throughout Vermont do, residential zoning districts do allow duplexes as well.
And is Ellen still with us?
Yes.
And didn't we sort of gently start to approach the issue of if you have single family zoning, any single family zoning could allow for duplexes or quadplexes, and we had to come back to say something about consistent with the character of the neighborhood?
Your committee at one point did consider the requirement that towns allow duplexes to the same extent as single family zoning.
Right,
You've had, and that did not pass.
right. Well, we
Yeah.
did do something in that area with character of the neighborhood, didn't we? So you can go in for a conditional use or something?
Right. So for dwellings up to 4 units, towns are still allowed to do conditional use review permits for those. And then, but you did add to the statute that they cannot be denied based on the character of the area. So a town still has the ability to have permits for those kinds of units up to 4 units and set, some restrictions on the kinds of things that they're going to review as part of that permit process. But they can't be denied solely for the character of the area.
So this is where we need a little education, and I'm sure Karen will help us here as well. But so if there is a 1 acre zoning for single families only in a town zoning land use bylaws, and I come in and I say, I want to build or divide this up into 4 units, do I have a right to at least be heard, or will the town say to me, no, this is 1 acre zoning? I mean, this is single family zoning.
Yeah, not necessarily a right to be heard. The town could, but under that scenario, unless the town has provided in the bylaws that is an option that would require a conditional use review, potentially not. So unless they provide for that in their bylaws, no, they can't do that.
Okay, so I'm a little confused what they can or cannot do. Did we, by the law we passed, allow for quadplexes in every zone in towns, or in every town, or do the towns with zoning, they could pass other restrictions that would effectively prohibit people coming in? But if they didn't pass anything, does the state law override the town zoning ordinance and say you have a right to go in and build a quadplex in that what used to be a single family zone?
The language in Title 24 still says that a municipality has to allow multi-unit dwellings somewhere in the town, but not necessarily in every district. They can still use a zoning district that has a single family housing only.
Okay. So we didn't do much except to make sure that in some area of the town, there could be quadplexes.
Right. And so in the areas of the town that have been designated for multi-unit dwellings,
Right.
now you can't deny them by saying they don't match the character of the area.
Got it. Thank you. I know you've tried to drill that into me for many times, but I think I get it now. I'll probably forget it again, but thank you. Okay, let's move on. Jacob.
Yeah, so in terms of the size, most bylaws don't place too many limitations on the unit size of duplex. duplexes, but there would always be dimensionals, or almost always be dimensional standards that would apply, setbacks, height limitations, maybe some design. Whereas for the ADU, it's the greater of 30% of the principal dwelling or a maximum of 900 square feet. So that's where there's that size difference where the ADU is a bit more constraining, at least under state statute, than what we would see for most duplexes. In terms of lot sizes, the ADU is more flexible in that they're not subject to additional land area, except land area that would be needed to accommodate in-ground septic. But what we do see on a lot of municipal bylaws is that duplexes are subject to a larger lot size. For instance, it might be 10,000 square feet to add an additional unit. So you would need a larger lot size to do a duplex, and that could make it harder to build even a duplex that is of a very similar size and character to a single family home right next door. In terms of the dwelling unit classification, generally there's no real difference. Although the definition is in state statute for an accessory dwelling unit as a distinct unit, clearly subordinate to a single family dwelling, has independent facilities for living, sleeping, food preparation, and sanitation. Duplexes tend to have pretty clear fire safety jurisdiction, and whereas an ADU, it depends on their classification as a public building. So that would be something that Mike DeRocher at Fire Safety would be able to detail and with a lot more experience than I have in that. They both need water, wastewater permits to construct. The covenants, there's now restrictions where new private covenants cannot exclude ADUs in subdivisions, but as far as I know, private covenants still can exclude duplexes and other forms of naturally affordable housing as part of new subdivisions.
Could I just go back?
Yeah.
And what does your understanding of the word subordinate mean?
Well, I think if we would, I think I would look at that through the lens of the size restrictions as it being the 30% or 900 square feet.
Yeah, anything smaller is subordinate, isn't it? I mean, it's significantly smaller, 30% of 100%. It means 70% is still the primary dwelling. So
Right. But we got rid of the issue of where the owner had to live.
right.
And I think the word subordinate appears in the statute, but I'm wondering, is it basically that the bigger unit, the smaller unit is subordinate, and as long as you have different, does that mean that you couldn't have 50% and 50%? Because, well, I don't know, maybe if it's small, if it's less than 900 square feet, maybe you could. So is there I don't know, Ellen, can you help us out with subordinate? It may not be necessary, I guess. I don't know anymore.
Yes, I think that when looking at this definition, you're looking about adding something to an existing structure, either just by reconfiguring the existing building or with new construction. And so I do think it largely it's just about size, right? It needs to be lesser than the existing part, but you did remove the requirement that people can live in either. So I don't think there's an inherent conflict there.
Right. No, I don't either, except if you wound up splitting it exactly in half, you might not have one or the other units being subordinate, regardless of where you live, and you can get yourself in trouble. I think you probably could put another tile down on the floor somewhere and achieve that result. Anyhow, okay. So we down to.
Yeah, so in terms of the flood hazard area, the preemption doesn't apply to any flood hazard areas, and so for duplexes, that would not that would be locally regulated under their flood hazard or river corridor bylaws. Both could be subject to local impact fees for new dwelling units. And in terms of assessments, one of the things that we've heard from some towns, and Karen may be able to speak to this too, that sometimes the assessors are not sure how to value these, or they have a difficult finding comparables.
Well, now they can look at California.
Yeah.
Jacob, this chart you have up on the screen is different from the chart you sent us that's on our webpage. So if you could send your updated chart to Scott, that would be appreciated.
Absolutely.
So what I'm taking away from this, and it's global, is that the real difference between an ADU and a duplex, as long as we don't have any zoning laws that allow for duplexes or mandate duplexes be allowed in all zoning areas, is that the ADU law effectively allows 2 living units anywhere in the state, as long as it qualifies as an ADU. That's not the case if it's a duplex. And if we got rid of owner occupied, then in some ways we would be allowing for greater access for housing and for ADU development or sale later on. And it would be another way to get more units throughout the state, and not just in, well, but it just becomes much more similar to a duplex at that point. I mean, that's, to me, other than the size element, that's the big, that would be the big difference right now in our laws. I mean, I look through your chart, there's a lot of technical differences, but the 2 big ones are size and owner occupancy. Would you agree with that, Jacob?
Yeah, and the built form, in that the ADU can be 2 separate buildings, whereas a duplex is generally 1 building.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, I lose sight of that because I keep thinking of, building an ADU in a basement or in the back, or not in the back, but, on the side of a house and carving out part of your house. But yes, we could put mobile homes back there. We could turn a carriage house into an ADU and all that stuff. So yes, there's more opportunity there. Okay. Senator Clarkson, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just, I look forward to the owner occupied issue because I think it, coupled with the short-term rental challenge we face, it has a real, may have real impact on our neighborhoods, which, quite honestly, I treasure my neighborhood. And I've already seen it gutted by homes that have been bought up and turned into short-term rentals where we never know anybody who's coming in and out. I have a real, I guess I'm just, I grew up in Buffalo where there were tons of duplexes. They were very standard and families lived in them long term. I mean, people own them separately, but people lived there for a long time. They were part of the fabric of the neighborhood. I think we have a balancing act here between maintaining the quality of our neighborhoods and also increasing housing stock. And I think one of the things I like about ADUs is that they are subordinate to the invested owner in that community. And certainly renters can become invested in their communities. There's no question. And hopefully, as we saw in that presentation, many of those renters are long-term in the ADUs. I think there was one chart that said, they were there, they were pretty long-term. They lived there for a long stretch of time. Yep. So I think we have a balancing act here, quite honestly, and particularly with all the other pieces that we're looking at. I just would be, I'm a neighborhood enthusiast, and the qualities of our neighborhoods are important. And increasing density is important, but I don't think that challenges the quality of the neighborhood as much as having just landlords renting spaces.
Yeah, well, I think, there is some tension. I'm not sure I would fully agree that, being able to rent the house fully out in 2 units without living there necessarily impacts the quality of the neighborhood. But I mean, we'll have to have that discussion. It wasn't lost on me that I think all the national experts in that thing saying one of the big problems in making this a useful tool was the owner occupancy requirement. And Mayor Weinberger said he was very disappointed that he couldn't get that through in the city of Burlington.
Yep, no, I heard that. I just,
so
as a,
it could take a fairly significant step forward and dilute it significantly if we don't get rid of the owner occupied criteria. But as usual, there's probably some middle ground out there. We just have to sweet spot. Maybe we can find it. Anyhow, let's hear from Karen. So I don't know if you remember, Karen, you and I go way back on this issue. I don't know if they say it's 30 or 40 years. I can't remember.
It's not 40. It's not 40.
Okay, 30. Okay, so 1992. I think that's what Ellen told us. The first law was passed. Jessica Oski and I worked on this law, and I came up against the power of the league. I remember that. What committee were we in? We're upstairs somewhere. I don't know if it was.
good, a housing committee.
I don't know if it was institutions or it was an odd committee for me, but I remember that. It was a long battle. Almost remember the number of the bill. I think it was 202 or something like that. But anyhow, welcome, Karen.
Thank you. Karen Horn with the League of Cities and Towns. I will just say that situations, circumstances, and people all evolve.
Right.
So here we are.
Right.
I did want to just refer to the statute for a moment regarding the question of owner occupied and other conditions. So the statute 4412 sub 1 sub E says that no bylaw shall have the effect of excluding one accessory dwelling, right, located within or pertinent to a single family dwelling on an owner occupied lot. And the unit means it's clearly subordinate to a single family dwelling, has facilities and provisions for independent living, including sleeping, food preparation, and sanitation. And we actually heard in a couple of not the webinar necessarily this morning, but in the AARP guide, I believe, that some units don't have food preparation. If it's actually your mother-in-law living in there, she might use your kitchen. But anyway, I think that the thing to remember is that it also says nothing in the section on ADUs shall be construed to prohibit a bylaw that is less restrictive of accessory dwelling units. And so, for instance, in my community, the bylaw regarding ADUs does not include owner occupied requirement. And I think that if we leave it to the discretion of the towns, you will maybe have owner occupied requirements in communities that have large vacation and populations, people who are coming in to ski areas and everything, and have all the other issues around, short-term rentals and all those kinds of things. But in other communities where you don't have those stressors, it makes sense to not require the owner occupancy. The way I'm looking at this is that a bylaw that was less restrictive could also not require the food preparation section, for instance, in an accessory dwelling unit. I will say that, as you've discussed pretty extensively, the issue of policing owner occupancy is difficult. How you don't want to have to go out all the time to make sure that the owner is in the unit, and how long does he have to be in the unit, he or she. If it's a snowbird that is in the main unit, is that owner occupied? Those are all questions that I think the municipal level can deal with, and one size is not going to fit all. So I would urge you to keep the discretion that you've already provided in the statute around that.
How
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised by your position, but I was going to ask, is there any way that you can think of to keep that discretion, but incentivize the towns to pass bylaws like your town?
I think, well, I don't have I haven't looked at all the zoning bylaws around the state. You would perish if you had to do that. But so I don't really have a good sense of how many towns are less restrictive in that regard. I do think that for a lot of people, the issue of where do you start as a homeowner, because what we also heard in these presentations is that you're basically looking at homeowners doing this on their own. It's very small scale. And I sort of like the idea of having a guru for accessory dwelling units, but I think that you might want to expand that to individually owned housing units, or something that might encompass the duplex option, if people need help with those kinds of things. And I do think the financing issue is significant for a lot of people, because when you start out, when you say that you're going to build an ADU or another unit in your house, all of your risk is up front, is my understanding, that you wouldn't be able to get the loan ahead of having built it and realize the rentals income stream as an individual. So I think that is something to definitely take a look at. The zoning for great neighborhoods is a really good program. We're one of those towns that's involved in revising our bylaws to address their priorities and providing for more housing. I think an awful lot of towns are looking to do that now, because just because the housing situation is so very dire. Mm-hmm. And I'll just make a plug while I'm here because I haven't seen your omnibus housing bill, but we have supported H511 that's in the House right now, and we would support those provisions in your bill as well.
Yeah, I need to spend some time this evening with both the economic and housing bill. It's pretty much a cut and paste job, but I should release them to the committee so they have something in writing. And 511 is in the housing bill. Yeah. So that's really all I have to offer right now. We're happy to be part of the conversation. I wasn't really sure which direction the committee was thinking about going. So. Well, we're going to need your help on this. I want to find, in some ways, I know housing is important to you as well, and we're doing a lot of things, giving a lot of money to municipalities to help in this. But sometimes, quite frankly, I think local control gets in the way, and we have to find the balance that promotes certain policies that will sometimes step on local control. But like the accessory dwelling units did 30 years ago. I think that was one of the arguments that, you're starting to tell the towns what to do in certain cases. So that's where we're going. I want to go ahead.
If I could just add one other thing, that the statute talks about the property having sufficient wastewater capacity, which of course, yes, we need that. But I do think that for a lot of people who are in units that have been here for a long time, the regulations around wastewater capacity have changed, like the gallons per bedroom have been reduced over the years. And part of what the housing guru might speak to is whether your wastewater capacity actually would now accommodate an additional unit where it wouldn't have 20 years ago when it was built or something like that. So I think that is a real issue for
Yeah,
folks.
that's good. That's promising. Yep. So going back to the example you were given about ski towns, I'm going to have to try and resurrect my question.
I'd say seasonal, the ones that have a high proportion of seasonal residents.
Okay.
I
And
mean,
Yes.
Woodstock is a great example.
okay. So Karen, you were saying that in those towns, by getting rid of owner occupied, you may invite more short-term rentals. Is that what the basic question was?
I think that I think that you would be best served by leaving the requirement about owner occupancy up to the towns, and they could, in those communities that have a lot of seasonal traffic, is that the right term, Senator Clarkson?
Seasonal residents and
Yes.
seasonal traffic.
They may make the determination that for a number of reasons, they want to retain the owner occupancy requirement. And if they don't retain that requirement, they may see even more short-term rentals than they see
Right.
today.
Just to think outside the box, wouldn't an alternative be to say, remove the owner occupied, but say the rental has to be an annual rental?
So I think what you want to do is you want to make it easy and accessible and a reasonable choice for people to build an accessory dwelling unit. And the more restrictions you put on that, the more it's going to give people pause as to whether they actually want to make that kind of investment or not.
I think we all agree with that, but I was just suggesting an alternative to owner occupied, which is another restriction that you have. And I think the owner occupied becomes a bigger restriction than going out and finding a tenant who might want to, be a long-term tenant. So that would avoid the short-term rental problem that lifting the owner occupied restriction may protect now. So
it doesn't fully, sadly. I think ADUs kind of assume that there is someone else who's there most of the time. I mean,
Right.
And sadly, in towns with this much wealth, there are lots of people who will rent a house for a whole year and use it only on the weekends. I mean, who don't live in a community, but who could rent a house on a yearly basis and not be full-time residents, don't send their kids to the school. I mean, our communities are getting gutted Woodstock is now over 50% owned by people who don't live here.
Yeah.
You can easily make it a primary residence. There are easy ways to make it to indicate, but it's just another nail in the coffin on our neighborhoods in a town that is already challenged.
Taking that one step further, we've been talking a lot about ADUs versus duplexes. What's to stop right now an ADU from being a short-term rental?
I don't believe there is anything.
So,
Nothing.
Chris,
Although towns they have the ability to regulate short-term rentals in their
Well,
bylaws.
that is true. And it does say that in the statute also. nothing shall be construed to prohibit a bylaw that regulates short-term rental units distinctly from residential rental units.
Okay, glad we put that in.
It was prescient.
No, we did. I mean, that came in 2 years ago. I think that we were trying to deal with short-term rentals, and at least we said we want to give the municipalities some power.
Right, we gave them the opportunity to create their own ordinances.
Right.
To regulate short-term rentals.
So that's a good point, in terms of the concern for seasonal rentals proliferating a town that got rid of the owner occupied criteria. The town could also put in an ordinance and say, thou shalt not use this ADU as a short-term rental.
Well, some of us were on the forefront of creating the ordinances for those short-term rentals. That's what we based our work on.
Right. So there is an alternative there that could protect against short-term rentals, but at the same time allow for greater development of ADUs like all those experts said we should do.
I think that just based on the bylaws that I've read relative to that, they don't necessarily say it shall not be a short-term rental. They regulate it with respect to occupancy and parking and number of days that it can
Number
be
of days.
rented, that kind of unit.
Right.
So
Okay. Well, this conversation will be continued because it's an important thing that I think is, if we don't get rid of it, we're potentially losing an opportunity, but it's not the kind of thing that I want to leave to, we're talking about like the existing law under VHIP could establish a lot of the things we want to do already to encourage ADUs by putting a certain amount of money towards ADUs. But this is not something that I'd want to give the authority to the agency to make a decision on. So we'd have to change the statute anyhow, because right now it is owner occupied only. So we'll be talking about this some more. Anything else? I know people have a hard stop in about 6 minutes. I can give you a little bit extra time. Karen will have you back. Chris, we always want to have you around. So,
And you, Karen. We
and
all-
Ellen and Jacob and everybody on my screen. So thank you, members of the public. Anybody's watching, we never know. Someone says Scott could tell us how many people are on YouTube, but I don't know how to do that.
could I just make one more suggestion with respect to the VHIP program? I mean, you could say as a condition of getting the VHIP money for an ADU that the owner occupied requirement not be part of, that you
Right.
could condition the VHIP money that way.
Right, and not necessarily affect the rest of the law, just ones that are
Right.
following through. That's an idea. It's a partial way of going. I think my hope is that we will get enough ADUs in development, and I have a feeling a bunch of them will have state support at this until the private sector can come in and do this. So there may be, thank you for that suggestion. Yep. Okay. We're gonna go off live and we'll see folks on the floor at